So yesterday I made my way home from St. Louis, where I was attending the annual gathering of the United Church of Christ Council on Health and Human Service Ministries, otherwise known as CHISM. Say it with me, CHISM. It's kind of a fun little acronym. The meeting brings together leaders and friends of the 70 or so member agencies from the council. Those member agencies have between them about 400 different communities or service locations across our country, providing ministries ranging from senior living to acute care to child daycare to child and family services and more. You might not realize that your United Church of Christ CHISM partners provide over 20,000 units of affordable housing, including Roundhouse Manor in Kaukauna, not too far away. Over the past year, they've provided community-based ambulatory health care for 5 million people, served 48,000 youth through their child and family service support programs, and here's the big one. They provided $864 million in unreimbursed charitable care this past year. $864 million. That's the cost of care that is not reimbursed by Medicaid or Medicare for things like skilled nursing, low-income housing, counseling for troubled youth, and much more. You might be able to tell I'm really proud to serve on the national board of CHISM, but that's not what this sermon is about. The opening worship service for the CHISM meeting took place at the brand new Deaconess Center for Child Well-Being. We were a part of the dedication of that space, and we shared in blessing every room, every hallway, every corner of the property. It's located just north of the St. Louis City Family Court System, and the facility is built to offer safe space for children and youth. It serves as a headquarters for other affiliated nonprofits serving children and families, and it's meant to be an open place where community members can gather and groups can meet to collaborate and plan for the future. Their mission is to build power to advance child well-being by strengthening alliances for child-friendly policy and mobilizing community partners and faith communities to advocate for the well-being of all children. This Deaconess Center is the newest expression of a deaconess movement that is well over 120 years old. You might not know about the Deaconess Sisters of St. Louis. They're a part of our CHISM heritage, and they're a part of our United Church of Christ heritage. In 1889, a group of Protestant women committed themselves to being trained as nurses and forming an intentional faith-based community of healthcare workers, providing care to the most vulnerable. Eventually, the Deaconess Hospital in St. Louis and then the Deaconess healthcare system became a leader in primary healthcare. Someone this morning remembered that Aurora Sinai in Milwaukee used to be Deaconess Hospital. Although that Deaconess sisterhood died out, the spirit of that movement lives on in what is now the Deaconess Foundation. Now, that's not what this sermon is about either. But you might want to know that about 20 years ago when the foundation was created, when the hospital and its property were sold, they had about $55 million available in assets. Over these last years, they've distributed upwards of $80 million in grants and awards, and by the grace of God, says their CEO, guess how many assets they now hold? $55 million. So now with this new center on this new property, who knows what the future of that deaconess movement might look like. But that's not what this sermon is about either. I just didn't know if you knew about that connection. If someone asked if you knew whether your church, your United Church of Christ, was involved in that kind of work, would you know to say yes? Anyway, that opening worship service that I started to tell you about started outside the building. We were greeted outside by an African drumming and dance troupe from East St. Louis. They met us in the parking lot and treated us to about 30 minutes of percussion and dancing in the courtyard space. I think somebody has that on video, and I'm trying to find out who that is so I can take it away. No. As we gathered on the newly planted grass in the sunshine with about, all 200 of us there, we could just feel God's presence stirring, moving like a heartbeat within us and in that community. This new building sits on a property that had once been abandoned. It's within view of a justice system that has yet to create equity in that community. The neighborhood around it has struggled. Many people have given up hope. But what we heard and saw and felt that day was hopeful, to be sure, as that community now looks forward to the positive presence this center can provide. That's not entirely what this sermon is about. I appreciate your patience listening to me talk on about this ministry several states away. I just wondered how many of you might be aware of that relationship, not just to the deaconess movement and ministry, but to the many ways our United Church of Christ aligns itself with that kind of Jesus work, care for and dignity for the least of these in our society. And I wonder how many of us might realize who's counting on us to claim our place in that work. Who might be wondering where we stand? So one last story about that opening service for now. The preacher for that day was an ordained pastor from Massachusetts, of all places. I think she must be in her maybe late 50s, early 60s. She brought the message that day because she was born in that neighborhood where the new Child and Well-Being Center now stands. And that building is on a property that used to be where kids would play ball or people from the neighborhood might gather. When that preacher was only 9 months of age, her mother or her parents, who likely struggled financially and maybe in other ways she'll never really know, they put her in her best dress and they laid her on a blanket in that park, and they left her there for someone else to find. She will never know the reasons behind that decision, but all those years ago, that family needed that place and that community to take that child in and give her the life that they could not. Her journey was not at all easy, but all these years later, here she was back at the same place, dedicating that holy ground for God's purposes to enrich the lives of children and families in that neighborhood today. Isn't that a remarkable story? I'm still not quite sure what to make of it myself, but I'm struck by the way God worked in her life and in that community too, and in the church, and in that very place where I found myself experiencing God's presence so intently. I think it's one of those moments that reminded me how serious it is, how important it is that we watch out for each other in this life, that we listen for those who might need us to be Jesus workers in our own time and place, that we be clear about who and whose we are. So enough about all that. This sermon is supposed to be about Peter. Maybe you're wondering if I might ever get around to him and this sort of cringeworthy narrative recounting his threefold denial of having anything whatsoever to do with Jesus. Now, John's gospel has this whole embarrassment unfold a little bit differently than the others. None of the other gospels spend quite so much time on the details surrounding Peter's questioning, but John tells us almost more than we really want to know. First of all, Peter's not there by himself. He and another unnamed but much loved disciple accompany Jesus to the house of Annas the high priest. The other disciple is familiar with that household, so he gets to go inside while Peter stands outside. The other disciple sends a servant to bring Peter in, but instead of going all the way in, Peter's sort of half in, sort of inside the gate, but not fully inside, which is just strange. And while Jesus is inside the house, answering question after question as clearly and directly as possible, "I don't have any secrets," he tells his captors. Peter chooses to warm himself by a little charcoal fire prepared by some of the servants and also some of the police guard who were there on site. And 3 times he is asked not whether he knows who Jesus is, but if he isn't one of Jesus' followers. You aren't one of his followers, are you? which is a funny way to ask the question because it sort of seems like the ones who ask it expect him to say no. You aren't one of his followers. It's almost like if you were, then what are you doing hanging around out here? Peter doesn't just deny that he knows Jesus, he denies his relationship with Jesus. He denies the connection that's between them. Oh no, he replies, I'm not one of them. Notice how the questions come not from the authorities or the ones in power, but from yet another unnamed woman in the Gospels, and then from some servants who are also trying to keep warm around that fire. Not the elite of that household or community, but the very ones who might be watching all of this unfold from a different perspective. The ones who are just the kind of people Jesus is in trouble with, for lifting up, for spending time with, for calling them sons and daughters, brothers and sisters. The ones who might be hoping and needing for this Jesus movement to continue, regardless of what transpires from inside the walls of that house where Jesus is. You aren't one of his followers, are you? They ask this awkward stranger. Because you sure don't act like it. And when one of them does peg Peter as one of the disciples, it's not because he's seen Peter exhibit any Jesus-like love or concern. He's a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off earlier that evening. He knows Peter not by his love, but by how quickly he turns to violence to solve his problems. All this while inside the house, Jesus suggests his captors stop questioning him and ask his followers, his disciples, what he's been up to. Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said. Or do they? So I have to go back to that preacher one more time. The one who was abandoned as an infant on the very ground where we were dancing and singing together. I told you her life was not easy after that. She was found by someone in that park, yes, but she was placed in a foster care system that shuttled her from home to home, where she experienced abuse and ridicule. She said she almost grew to believe what she heard and felt and experienced in her darkest moments, that she wasn't worth anything, that she wasn't worth being loved, that her life wasn't worth living. I could just about picture her turning to person after person in her life, those who had the means and the titles and the positions and the power to do better by her, but they didn't, or they couldn't, or they wouldn't. I could just about see her as a child suffering in ways she shouldn't have, as no child should have, watching for someone, anyone who might show her through their actions that they were who they said they were, when they said they would help or teach or provide justice or protection, when they said maybe that they were followers of Jesus. There was one person who made a difference for her. She had a godmother who kept her connected to a community of faith where she, the one who is now a preacher, heard Jesus' words and listened to what he said, that she was loved. Thank goodness she heard that truth over and above the lie the rest of the world was telling her. So I'm used to thinking about Peter's denials of Jesus in the Gospels as a series of lies, of falsehoods. But now I'm wondering, how convincing would his testimony be, standing on the edges of the courtyard, inside the gates but not too close to Jesus, warming himself next to someone else's fire, someone who needed it probably more than he did? How convincing a disciple does he make as he stays quiet and cares for himself first, leaving Jesus to his accusers? Maybe Peter isn't lying after all. You're not one of his followers, are you? You're not one of his followers, are you? And Peter replied, I am not. So we could talk about the lies we tell, we all tell them, But what if we grappled just for a moment with the truth? The truth that there continue to be so many, too many, who are left wondering whether anyone will do something, say something, make something happen to bring hope alive. The truth that we are among those who have heard what he has said, things like, love one another as I have loved you, or let the children come to me, or whenever you do this for the least of these, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those in prison, care for the sick, you do this for me. Things like love your neighbor. The truth that sometimes the greatest lie we tell involves pretending we have no part in this Jesus work, no connection, no calling to be advocates for justice, no responsibility for each other in this life. The truth that we have no idea sometimes how much of a difference just one of us can make for someone else. Now, if you know your gospel, you do know one more thing for sure. That even though Peter distances himself from Jesus, Jesus will not abandon Peter. Jesus does not give up on Peter, and Jesus never gives up on the church. The risen Christ appears on a shoreline and 3 times asks, "Do you love me?" And Peter doesn't hold back then. "Oh, yes, Lord, I love you," says the one who has struggled mightily to live into that love. And Jesus says then, "Feed my sheep, tend my lambs, feed my sheep." The truth is, God's love works through us sometimes, but around us and in spite of us all the time. God's love overcomes our failures, our weaknesses, and our denials every single time. We are a part of something, you and I, a part of a movement, a community, a history, a tradition, a narrative, a relationship with God through Christ that brings hope alive in the most unexpected ways. If someone asked you if you were a part of something like that, would you know to say, would you know that it would be right to say yes? Amen.